We have a different form than we usually have here. It won't be me, a lot of it. I'm going to sit down, and it'll be us together listening to a presentation about morally bad art, the relationship between the two. This man comes from a background in political philosophy, a philosophy of law, got his PhD at University of Toronto, and on the side, or when he was younger, he played a lot of piano, and so he's got his relationship to us as artists and creative people. But please open your minds, in the liberal arts sense of the word, to this presenter, and give a warm round of applause for Mr. Jonathan Pierson.
Thank you all very much. I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to talk about the relationship between art and ethics, or art and morality. And there are a lot of different things that you could talk about in relation to that, and how those two things might fit together or might not fit together. I've chosen one particular set of ideas, partly because I'd be really excited to hear what you guys think about them. And so some of the things that I'm saying, I'm sure that at least some of you are going to think sound completely crazy and off the wall. So if they do, I would love it if you would tell us why, or ask questions, just join into the conversation as we go along. So what I want to talk about, so the general question is about how art and morality relate to one another. And one important way of thinking about this question, about the relationship between art and morality, comes from, or is at least voiced by, Oscar Wilde. So here's what Oscar Wilde had to say. He was talking particularly about books. So according to Oscar Wilde, there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all. So in other words, how exactly do art and morality relate to one another? Well, they don't, right? They just don't have any connection to one another. Or, to put it maybe more precisely, whatever it is that the book is communicating, the kind of moral attitudes that it has, or the moral features that it has, are just irrelevant to the question of whether it's a good book or a bad book, right? When you want to know whether a novel is a good novel, you don't ask if it has a nice, morally appropriate message. If you want to know whether a novel is a bad novel, say you talk about things like it's boring, it's not well put together, the characters aren't believable, or something like that. But you don't ask about what kind of things it's communicating, morally speaking, right? So in other words, so what Oscar Wilde is saying is just that these things don't relate to one another at all. And I imagine that, it seems to me that the same thing might be said for music. So the idea would be that music is good or bad on its own terms. It doesn't really matter but morality doesn't really matter here, right? So music is interesting or boring or well put together. It appeals to us, or it appeals to its particular audience, or something like that, but doesn't really have, morality just doesn't enter into the picture in any way. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about, the question of whether that's true, that morality doesn't enter into the picture when we think about good or bad art. And in particular, I'm going to focus on bad art because, I'm going to focus on art where you can make the case that is bad. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, but because it's kind of interesting. So one thing I should clarify a little bit. I'm going to use terms like aesthetic evaluation. And what I mean by that is our evaluation of an object's value as a work of art. So what we want to know is how do we think about, does morality have any role to play when we think about aesthetic evaluation, whether a work of art is good or bad as a work of art? And just to get clear on what this idea of aesthetic evaluation is, you can contrast it to things like the economic value, or so the aesthetic value of art is its value as a work of art. You can contrast it to economic value, so like the value that the work would bring in the market, right, if you sold a painting or something. And you can also contrast it to historical value. So for example, maybe a particular piece of music has a lot of interest to historians down the road because it'll tell you something about North American culture in the early part of the 21st century or something. But that's not what we're interested here. So let me just give you an example to help make this clear. So this is one of Damien Hirst's spot paintings. Anybody know about these? Yeah, so these are Damien Hirst, the artist who's famous for doing things like putting sharks in big vats of formaldehyde. This is his most recent thing, and he shows at the Gagosian Gallery. There are 11 of those around the world, and he's got these spot paintings currently in the Gagosian galleries all around the world. And one kind of nice thing, if you're interested, you can go, if you go to all of the galleries and see the spot paintings, get a little card. You got to get your card stamped at each gallery, and you get a free Damien Hirst print. Sort of could be valuable, maybe. So this is Damien Hirst, his current spot paintings. Now, one thing that is probably true is that these paintings are going to make Damien Hirst a lot of money. Damien Hirst's works have sold for a lot, and so they're probably making a lot of money, and that has to do with the economic value of things. It might also have historical value, right? Because down the road, people might want to know, might think this will tell us something about the art world in our time, right? But that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in whether these, when we talk about the aesthetic value, we're interested in whether this is a good work of art, not how much people will pay for it, not what it tells us, historically speaking, about our culture, or what it tells future historians about our culture. So we want to know whether this is a good work of art. Okay? Now, so that's Damien Hirst. Here's one that Banksy got his hands on. There are 4 kinds of questions that I want to introduce to you, and we'll talk about at least about a few of them, or we can talk about more of them if you like. And here they are. So the 4 questions: can an artwork be morally flawed? So when we talk about the value of a work of art, the aesthetic value of a work of art, does morality have anything to do with it? In particular, can an artwork be morally flawed? Can it be morally bad? And if so, should its moral flaws affect our aesthetic evaluation of it? And then, so those are 2 questions I want to talk about. And then down beyond that, there are a couple of other questions. Do artworks have destructive effects on their audience? And so sometimes you hear things in the media about, well, these artworks cause people to engage, viewing certain kinds of violent art makes people more likely to engage in violent behavior. Or maybe it gives us a bad character or something like that. So do artworks really have this kind of effect on their audience, right? And if so, right, what should the community's attitude be towards that? Should a just community tolerate morally flawed artworks? So I want to think mostly about the first 2 of these questions, right? Can an artwork be morally flawed? Can we talk about an artwork as being good or bad, morally speaking? And if so, should its flaws affect our aesthetic evaluation of it? And to think about that, I want to talk about a particular example, which comes from, I think is particularly helpful for thinking about this. It comes from the black metal scene in the early 90s. I don't know if anybody into black metal? A few of you. Good. So you may not, this may be something new to you. I realize the early 90s is a really long time ago already. But it's worth sort of thinking about. So this guy, Varg Vikernes, he is one of the most important, most influential musicians of the black metal scene in the early 90s. And he's also known for a number of other things. His band is a one-man band, is called Pierson, which means, I believe, darkness in Norwegian. And he's, as I said, the sole member of the band. He released a bunch of albums up until 1993, and then he's recently started releasing albums again. But he's not known only for his music. So here's one sort of thing that got him into the news. This is a shot of Fantoft Stave Church, which is in Norway. It was built in around 1150. And in 1992, it was destroyed by arson. So someone burned it down. This was a first in a series of church burnings in Norway. So a bunch of people were burning, and people, it turned out, who were involved in the black metal scene were burning very old churches down. And this picture is actually a reconstruction of the church. The church was reconstructed after it was burned down. Varg was actually involved in this, and he was convicted of burning this and a number of other churches. That's not the only reason they got him into the news. He is also, so this is a picture of the two members of the black metal band Mayhem. So this guy right here goes by the name Dead, and that guy goes by the name Euronymous. Dead, I mean, now this is probably sort of, not something that can really be traced to that Varg can be held responsible for. But Dead committed suicide, I believe, in around 1991, 92, using shotgun shells that Varg gave him. But Euronymous is the more important figure here. Euronymous was killed by Varg in 1993, stabbed a number of times. And Varg was convicted of murdering Euronymous in 1994. And he was also convicted at that time of the church arsons. And he was imprisoned until he was finally released on probation in 2009. Okay, so he's known for a number of things. If you're interested at all in black metal, there's a documentary that came out in 2009 called "Until the Light Takes Us," and it has extended interviews with him that took place in prison. You'll learn a lot about him in prison. You learn about, for example, his anti-Christianity. Part of the reason why he burned some of those churches was because he thinks of Christianity as a kind of foreign religion in the context of Scandinavia, and he thinks that the sort of displaced the old and more important gods, or at least he's interested in talking that way. But he's also very anti-capitalist and very anti-American. So you'll learn about that if you watch the documentary. But there are a number of views of his which, weirdly enough, you don't learn much about if you watch the documentary. And these are even probably more disturbing. So if you look on his website, you can find a number of things that he'll say that are pretty awful. And among the views that he holds, he's anti-Semitism, white supremacism. He's clearly a pretty racist guy, and also homophobia. Okay, so that's Varg. Now I want to play you just a little bit of a song from his band Pierson, which this is from a 1993 album, and the song is called Dunkelheit, which means darkness. And this is a good example. This is a good example of his kind of music. Oh, okay. That's all right. So the song is actually kind of long, so I can't play you the whole thing, but I want to play you enough to give you a good sense of what the music is like, because it'll be helpful for thinking about the issues of art and morality that we want to talk about. So hopefully everything will go fine. Here we go, Dunkelheit. See if it. That's probably enough. So here's what let's go back now to the two questions I asked. Can an artwork be morally flawed? And if so, should the moral flaws affect our aesthetic evaluation of it? Now, we can't, I mean, I've suggested that Varg is not a morally admirable person. But of course, that doesn't mean that his work is morally bad, right, or morally somehow suspect. So in order for us to say that the work was morally flawed, that this song or this album was morally flawed, we'd have to be able to say something like that it manifests somehow morally bad attitudes, or that it somehow represents a morally bad conception of the world or something like that, right? And so the mere fact that Varg himself is homophobic and racist and so on doesn't show that his music is, right? So you might think, well, look, just like Oscar Wilde said, there's the question of the artist is one thing, the question of whether the artwork is good or bad doesn't depend, or doesn't turn on issues about morality, right? So that's one kind of view that you could take, right? But that's not the only view that you could take. And there are really two competing philosophical views on this sort of thing, about how art and morality relate to one another. So one of these views we can call autonomism, and the other view we can call aesthetic moralism. And autonomism is basically the idea that if a work is morally flawed, right, if it, for example, it has a morally bad picture, it displays a morally bad or morally awful picture of the world, that doesn't mean, that's irrelevant to whether it's a good work of art, right? Some great works of art show really awful pictures of the world. The standard example that people talk about is a film that was made in 1934 called Triumph of the Will, right? Triumph of the Will is a documentary of the 1934 Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, right? And many people say, look, this is a masterpiece of filmmaking. It's a great film, but morally it's disgusting, right? Because it kind of glorifies Hitler, it glorifies the Nazi Party, it glorifies all of the awful things that the Nazis were doing, right? Great work of art, morally reprehensible, morally bad. Those two things don't have anything to do with one another, right? so you might think, look, the two things are just separate. And you could also point to, works of art that have a good, kind of a positive, a nice message, but that aren't that great as works of art. So any Avatar fans here? So yeah, Avatar's got a, kind of an interesting message about colonialism, about the treatment of indigenous peoples, about destruction of the environment and things like that in the pursuit of profit. But it kind of does it in a pretty heavy-handed way, kind of, it's not that great as a movie, as a work of art, right? So even though the message is good, morally kind of nice, it's not a great work of art, or at least, someone might say that, right? So the two things are meant to be kind of separate according to autonomism, and this is exactly the kind of view that Oscar Wilde was trying to put forward, right? But the other kind of view that you could have is you could say that the ways, if a work of art is morally bad, right, like Triumph of the Will or something like that, then it might also be aesthetically bad. So the moral badness might make it aesthetically bad, okay? And that's a different, that sort of says autonomism isn't true, right? The Triumph of the Will is a bad movie as a work of art because it glorifies Hitler, right? So those are the two kinds of views that you could take, and the question is, well, how do we think about them? Which one do we think is right? So I want to say just a little bit more about moralism and how you might argue for it. And moralism has a lot of people who have defended it, and one of them is a famous philosopher from the 18th century, David Hume, and he talked about it with respect to poetry, right? So he wanted to say, look, if you think about poetry, right, poetry is describing, say he was thinking, for example, of Homer, the poetry of people like Homer in ancient Greece, describing the exploits and the attitudes of the heroes of ancient Greece. And he's saying, well, those people aren't particularly that admirable, right? It's very hard for us to admire the things that they were doing and the way that they were feeling. And part of the problem with the poem is that it presents them as admirable, right? And so it's flawed as a work of art. And the reason it's flawed is because we can't really admire them. We can't sort of feel emotions of admiration for what these people are doing, right? So here's what he says. He says, where vicious manners are described, so he's talking about where people are doing bad things. We're describing people doing bad things. So we're describing people doing bad things without them being marked with the proper characters of blame and disapprobation. So, but they're doing bad things, but they're being presented in a positive light, right? Then Hume says, this must be allowed to disfigure the poem, right? It makes it a worse poem, and to be a real deformity. I cannot, nor is it proper I should, enter into such sentiments. So in other words, if a work of art presents people doing really awful things and asks us to admire them, then there's something problematic about that. We can't really feel that kind of admiration. So one kind of example, so the idea here is that works of art ask us to feel certain things, right? They ask us to respond in certain ways to the work. And if, the way in which they're asking us to respond is not appropriate, then we're going to feel uncomfortable. We can't really enjoy that. So, a kind of easy way to make this clear what's going on here is you think about like something like a racist joke, right? Well, you say, well, look, a racist joke is asking you to laugh at something that's really not funny. It would be morally bad to laugh at that kind of thing. And so that's a kind of a flaw of the joke. The joke is not really funny because of the way in which it's asking you to laugh at something that isn't funny. So this is the kind of view that moralists take about the relationship between art and morality. And I just want to give you now a contemporary philosopher's version of this. So this is a kind of way of arguing for this moralistic view. And the idea is, look, and this picks up on what I've just been saying about Hume, works of art prescribe certain responses from us, right? In other words, that's the idea that they ask us to feel certain ways, or they ask us to respond in certain ways to what the work is doing, to what the work is trying to say. So, for example, take a horror movie, right? A horror movie asks us to imagine certain ways the world might be, right? So imagine it's like a serial killer, right? find out the killer's in the house, right? The call is coming from inside the house. Well, the movie asks us to imagine the world being that way, right? But it also prescribes a certain response, right? You're supposed to feel fear when you realize that the call is coming from inside the house, that the killer's in the house, or when you see the killer, sort of the axe of the murderer rising up behind the latest victim, right? You're supposed to kind of feel fear as a response. So the horror movies ask for us to feel that kind of response, right? And so here's another example. Anyone into Grand Theft Auto? So this is a kind of a good example of this sort of thing, right? So I'm most familiar with the fourth version of the game. So in that one, there's this guy, Nico Bellic, and he's implied to have done all these kind of horrible things in the past. He's a killer, he's a smuggler, it's implied that he's engaged in human trafficking. And really what the game does is it asks us to imagine having a past like that, right? It asks us to imagine how we would feel. It asks us to have a certain kind of response to that, right? So it kind of asks us to identify with Nico's way of seeing the world. It asks us to identify with, to admire his sense of sorrow, right? His questioning of the past, and also with his current role as someone who makes money from being a contract killer, right? And so also, in a sense, it asks us to share his sense of justification for what he's done, right? So that's the sense in which a work of art proscribes a response, right? It asks us to respond in certain ways. Okay, so then what we can say is, look, if a work is asking us to is asking us to respond in certain ways, we can always ask whether that response is merited, right? In other words, is it appropriate to respond in that way? And if the work tells us is asking you to respond in a particular way, but the response isn't merited, then that's a kind of a failure, right? So you imagine the horror movie, you're watching the horror movie, and you know that at this point you're supposed to feel fear, right? But the movie's just so poorly made, right? The movie's just so badly put together that all you can do is just laugh at how stupid it is, right? So in other words, the movie's aesthetically flawed. It's a failure as a work of art in a certain sense because of the way in which it doesn't merit the kind of fear that it's trying to get you to feel, right? So works can fail because they ask you to feel a certain way, they ask you to respond in a certain way, but you don't, they're so badly done that they don't get you to respond in that way. And now here's the important claim, right, which is the fourth one on the slide here. If a work prescribes a response that is unmerited because it would be immoral to respond in that way, this is an aesthetic defect, right? So in other words, the work is asking you to respond in a certain way, it's asking you to respond. So for example, think of the racist joke, right? That's a good way to make this clear, right? Is asking you to respond, but by being amused, by laughing, right? But it would be immoral to laugh, right? It would be no good person would laugh at that kind of joke. Then that's a failure of the work as a joke. It fails to be a good joke because nobody would respond. No one's going to respond in that way, right? And so what this argument is supposed to show is that some moral flaws that artworks have are also aesthetic flaws, right? So that's the basic argument for moralism. Now, not everyone is convinced by this sort of argument. So here's a way of sort of pushing back at it. And this comes from two philosophers named Justin Darms and Daniel Jacobson. And what they want to say is, look, you can distinguish between what they call the fittingness of a response and the moral appropriateness of having that response. So think of the joke again, right? Is the joke funny? Is it morally okay to laugh at it? Right? And what they want to say is that you can distinguish between those two things. It can be funny, but not morally okay to laugh, right? They also talk about envy as a way of making clear what they're talking about. So suppose that your roommate is walking down the street and finds an unmarked envelope with $10,000 in cash in it, right? Sort of wildly improbable stroke of good luck, right? And you're thinking about this and you say, well, this person has just had some really good luck. could have happened to me, right? If I had just been walking ahead of him instead of he walking ahead of me, then I would have found the envelope, right? And so you feel envious. And envy can be a kind of a fitting response. It can be fitting to feel envy because this person has had some good luck. And yet you think, okay, even though envy fits the situation here, it's morally wrong for me to feel envy. It's not okay for me to feel it, right? So I want to stop feeling it, even though I recognize it's kind of, in a way, it's fitting as a way of responding to someone's extreme, unwarranted good luck, right? And what the moralistic, so what Darms and Jacobson are saying is, look, when we think that moral flaws make a work of art a bad work of art, we're confusing those two things, right? We're confusing the fittingness of the response and the moral appropriateness of having it, right? So you get, so moralism starts to look kind of like a kind of a prudish view, right? And say, oh, that joke is not funny just because it would be wrong to laugh at it. Right? Well, a joke can be funny. It can sort of meet it can do the kinds of things that a joke needs to do in order to be funny and still be wrong to laugh at it. Right? So that's the big question that I want to sort of throw open to you. I mean, the big question that I want you guys to give you guys some tools to think about, which is, do you think, are you more sympathetic to autonomism, or are you more sympathetic to moralism as a way of thinking about the relationship between art and morality? And I'm not really here, I'm not going to try to convince you that either of these ones are true, right, or that either of these have got the right way of thinking about things. But these are some of the options out there. Now, let's go back to Burzum. I think that, that this music is a really good example for thinking about this. So the reason why is partly because Varg has a really well-developed, or somewhat well-developed, theories about things like art and what he's trying to do with his music. And here's what he has to say about art. And he's talking here about the cave paintings at Chauvet Cave in France, which are about 34,000 years old. Werner Herzog recently made a documentary about them called Cave of Forgotten Dreams, I think. So he's talking about these cave paintings. And he's saying, before Chauvet, right, so we're talking about people before the time of that these cave paintings were made, they didn't need art. And this is, by the way, this is from an interview that he did, that's posted on his website, that he did in 2011. So before Chauvet, they didn't even need art because their minds were so superior. They didn't need to record the beauty of their world. They managed to process all impressions properly just by looking at it. They could, for example, like a modern-day autistic savant, just take a look at the sky and memorize the positions of all the stars. So he has this conception that, you go way back about 40,000 years ago, there were this sort of race of superior beings, right? And they were so superior that they didn't even need art because they could just sort of harmonize with the world, right? And they could understand the world just by looking at it. But then, then at some point people started to need art, and they made things like these paintings, which are from the cave at Chauvet, Chauvet Cave. So now what he does, is sort of this conception of these superior beings, right? He connects that up with what we want out of art, or what at least he thinks some people want out of art. And here's what he says. Now, this is where things get really awful. So he says, look, we long for this time because we have this fantastic Neanderthal DA in us, as seen today as blonde hair, blue or gray eyes, and white skin. And just like you can feel phantom pains in a lost finger, we feel phantom pains in our severed minds that were broken by the mixing of Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis, beginning perhaps some 40,000 years ago. This despair causes us to produce art and to do weird things in an attempt to artificially create the harmony that we no longer are able to experience. So in other words, art for him is connected to a certain conception of racial supremacy, right? A certain really racist view about humanity and about the source of the problems in the world, right? So he says, alas, all that has been lost due to race mixing, and we keep doing it. digging our own grave in the process, right? So in other words, he thinks, look, if only these sort of blonde, blue-eyed people had just sort of kept to themselves, then we would be sort of better off, and we would have a much better art. And art, like everything else, he thinks, has been sort of deteriorating since then, right? So this is all pretty nasty stuff. But how does it relate to Pierson? How does it relate to the music that he makes, right? Does it have any relation, right? I mean, this just shows that he's a sort of a deeply messed up person with deeply awful views, right? How does it relate to the music that he makes? Well, here's what he says about what he's trying to do with the music. And the interviewer had asked him, he had talked at some point about the music and the way that he arranged music on the album as sort of allowing for the possibility of spells to be cast, right? Which I think he's talking about kind of metaphorically. He's not interested in actually casting spells, but he's interested in creating a certain kind of response to the artwork, and he's interested in the artwork allowing for that kind of response to be created. So here's what he says about his music. We can still get a glimpse of our Atlantis of the Neanderthal past. So in other words, of this kind of lost world in which the art was better, right? In which the people were better, according to him. We can still get a glimpse of that and awaken some lost abilities by casting spells, by entering a trance. If I'm allowed to return to the hypotheses of my wife, and he talks a little bit about what his wife thinks about sort of the history of Europe and things like that. This is what art is all about. Some is visual, paintings, photos, statues, etc. Some is made up of sounds, music, and some is verbal, books. Religion, too, is all about this, hoping and wishing for salvation from the original sin, in other words, the mixing of races or species, right? So, the point of music, and the point of his music in particular, is to allow us to kind of enter into a certain kind of conception of the world. Right? So the thought is that by listening to it, you can kind of imaginatively engage with this supposed lost past, with this supposed lost harmony, right? And here's what he says. I try to enable the listener to enter a certain state of mind where he's able to experience the harmony of our world. If you like the music, this probably works for you. If you don't, it probably doesn't work for you. So in other words, what Pierson's music does is to ask us to enter imaginatively into a certain kind of world and to experience it as good and right and like the way that things should be, right? But the problem is that the world that it asks us to enter into isn't actually good, right? The world that it asks us to enter into, the kind of experiences it asks us to enter into are awful, deeply repugnant, right? And so, the harmony that he has in mind here, the harmony that he talks about his music as trying to allow you to enter into is sort of horrible and awful from a moral point of view. And so what moralism would say is that the work, the music that he makes does not merit the response that he is trying to get it to, that it asks for, that it prescribes. And so it's kind of inviting us to have this response, but as none of us should want to have that response. None of us should want to enter into the music in that kind of way, right? And if that's right, of course, then moralism seems to be the way to go, right? So I want to just sort of, because it's sort of uncomfortable and sort of to have to talk about a person like Varg and his views about art, I want to talk about someone who, just end with talking about someone who I think has got a much better view of art, but sort of ties in with this, what Varg says he's trying to do with his music. So this is Arthur Danto, an American philosopher, and he says, it may just be one of the main offices of art, right? In other words, it's one of the functions, main functions of art, less to represent the world than to represent it in such a way as to cause us to view it with a certain attitude and with a special vision, right? So art is asking us to enter into a certain kind of world and to experience it. And that's one of the things that makes it powerful, according to Danto, but can also, I suppose, make it seem very dangerous. So what this sort of moralistic view suggests is that the kind of world that many artworks or that some artworks ask us to enter into is a kind of world that none of us would seriously think is a good one to enter into. And the special vision that they demand is one that no good person would want to have. And so the question that I want to kind of put out there is whether you think that this is an aesthetic failing, right? Does this actually make the work worse as a work, right, as an artwork? So that's kind of what I wanted to say, but I'm happy to hear how you guys respond. If you have questions or if you have comments about all of this, what reactions you might have, that would be great.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm a bass player, and I really like Victor Wooten as a bass player. And I really like him because I think his bass lines are just really sick bass. But if he was like, man, when I play my bass, I just think about killing babies. But I just like the bass lines. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, am I going to start, will I enter into his world of baby killing? If I, is there like an unconscious, I don't know. I mean.
I don't think necessarily. I mean, it depends on what, and with different kinds of music, I suppose it's going to be, we might give different answers. But it's one thing, I mean, we still have to remember to make a distinction between the kind of attitudes that the creator of the work has, right, which can be good or awful, right, you know, depending, and the kind of attitudes, the kind of experiences that the music is trying to convey, right? So that's why I think that what Varg says about his music is kind of so interesting, because he makes clear that he's not just sort of, it's not just that he thinks about these awful racist views while he's making the music, right? The music is, he has a conception of the superiority of a racist world, and the music is meant to allow you to enter into this sort of experience a world like that, right? So not all music is like that, right? But if that's sort of kind of what a musician is intending to get across with the music, right? And if the music is effectively doing that, then that seems sort of like worrisome, I suppose. At least that's what a moralist would say. Hey.
Can you go? Okay, there it is. Okay, so I kind of have this problem with assigning a morality to an artwork. Artwork is inanimate of itself. It's not, it has to be created by someone and it has to be perceived by someone. So to me, the morality isn't in the actual artwork, and it can only really exist in a few places. It can exist in the creation, it can exist in the reception of that creation, and it can exist in further display of it. And it's what you do with the artwork that creates the morality. And I think separating historical value from aesthetic is kind of a dangerous thing when you're talking about morality, just because seeing maybe a swastika before World War II, someone might have just thought, oh, that's a cool looking little doohickey, you know, and like hang it in their room or something. It was like, oh, that makes my room look really cool. So that could be aesthetically pleasing. But then as soon as you assign historical value and the morality and the actions of other people to it, you start thinking about it when you see that. I don't think that has anything to do with the aesthetic. And the disgust from seeing a swastika comes from the morality of the people associated with that.
Right.
And it has nothing to do with the aesthetic. So, like, I think a good example of this would be if you go to the paragraph that the dude wrote,
This
that.
one?
Yeah. What he's saying is, or I don't know, I guess it was a different paragraph, the one that he was talking about the mixing of races and stuff.
Oh, right, yeah, this one.
Yeah. That, if you look at it, is a paragraph which clearly expresses an idea, and he gets his point across very well, and he's well-versed, and is a textbook, technical, good paragraph, and is aesthetically good. But what his intention And his purpose of making that is where the morality comes in.
Right.
That's completely immoral. But aesthetically, I don't think it really has anything to do with the morality. Like, I could look at that and say, okay, well, if this was the only paragraph that I had to find out how to, write an English paragraph, then I'd be like, okay, well, there's the subject of that sentence, and
Right.
this is the way that I make that. So I could learn a lot from reading this paragraph about writing paragraphs, and regardless of the morality of it.
Right.
So.
Good. So, so you might think, well, look, we can separate a number of things. We can separate the style, right? And you're right. I mean, so he's not a native English speaker, right? He's got a pretty good command of English, right? So the style, the grammatical issues, whether this is a well-formed paragraph, right? We can separate the truth of the we can talk about the truth of the claims that it makes, right? I mean, these are full of a bunch of crazy and false claims, and we can talk about whether, what kind of response we have to reading it, whether the style is such that it gives us a certain kind of pleasure in reading it, right? And all of those things are separate from one another. I'm sympathetic to that insofar as, I think you make a good case for the kind of view that moralism wants to put forward. That's exactly what, that autonomism wants to say, right? That those things are all separate from one another. They're distinct, and we shouldn't. It's kind of a confusion to bring them together, right? But I'm really sympathetic to that. But I'm also just kind of I feel certain kind of discomfort with the thought with it also, and this is partly just me, I guess. But I feel like when I listen to his music, then when I start to think about, start to read this kind of stuff about how he's talking about what he's trying to allow the music to do for the listener, right? Then I start to feel like, oh, I shouldn't listen to that anymore, right? And in some sense, the better it is as art, the worse. The better it does at those kinds of at doing what he's trying to do with it, the worse it is for us to kind of listen to it, So that's not an argument against what you're saying, but it's just sort of an expression of the motivation.
Right. Can I just rebut that? I guess I know it's not an argument, but what I was going to say to that, if you didn't know the story of him, you just hear that, and you just hear this epic wall of sound, and I don't know, some people would react completely differently. Like, I might just start headbanging and be like, "Oh man, I'm so cool!" Like all this blah. But I mean, when you hear the story, and once you hear the historical significance, you can't, as a human being, really separate it from the aesthetic. So I don't know. That's what
Good. Thank you.
Also, about what you just said, I think that it has to do more with my morals more than Varg's morals. So say he wrote that thinking all his messed up thoughts that he has doesn't necessarily have to do, I think in a sense that's art, just the fact that what I think about it is totally, no, that's so wrong. I think that it's okay for him to have those type of morals, because in essence that's my reaction as being bad is okay, that's
okay.
art, you know what I mean?
So let me see if I get what you're suggesting. So you're a little bit worried about, is it something like this? You're a little bit worried about criticizing the artwork from the point of view of, say, the moral views that you hold or that I hold, right?
Yeah, I think that...
Because that's not where he's coming from?
Yeah, kind of it's not necessarily a failure or because of his morals, but it's more in a way, we're not able to interpret the art because we already have our idea of morals in our head. You know what I mean?
So we're sort of outside the world that he's in, and we can't enter it really.
Kind
right?
of, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sympathetic to that, except that I worry about I worry that we're really so that we can really sort of hold on to that idea that the two. I like this idea of saying he's in a separate world, right? In the sense of what that means is he just sees things differently, right? In a way that we can't see things that way,
Yeah.
right? And so, but I guess I worry about the thought that those two worlds really are so separate. I think they can come together, and that's the sort of thing that moralists are worried about, right? That art allows those two worlds to come together. It allows us to enter into a world that really, none of us should want to enter into, right? So I think, your point is is important, and I think that, but I guess, I mean, still, I'm just, again, sort of articulating kind of worries about why someone, or reasons why I think someone would want to hold the other kind of view.
Yeah. So basically what I'm saying is that maybe like our morals numb us to seeing art in a certain way because we have preconceived morals that, and if that's a failure, it's probably a failure on the artist's behalf if he's trying to convey a certain thing that people are not going to see it that way.
Right.
Then maybe
Good.
that's technically a failure, but still art.
Good. Yeah, no, certainly it's still art, right? That I absolutely agree with. But the question, but there's also another question, like once we think it's art, like then the question whether it's great art, you know, maybe sort of mediocre art or bad art, right?
Cool.
Thanks.
Hey, my name is Ferris, and first of all, kudos for being able to incorporate black metal effectively into presentation. But I have a question actually about the third and fourth questions, the ones that you didn't talk about as much. Is that okay? Are you? Can we discuss those two?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Okay,
Get back there.
you mentioned Grand Theft Auto briefly, and I thought that was kind of interesting. And if given the assumption that video games are art, and I know not everybody agrees with that, but if we're assuming that they are, do you think that you would have to take special considerations into account when you're judging the destructive effects or whether or not a community should tolerate them, since arguably they have a greater immersion and the person participating in the art actually is controlling how the art functions and what happens in the art? So the question is, do you think that they should be evaluated differently?
Yeah, good. I think, when it comes to this third and fourth question, it's important to keep in mind that we don't get an answer to the question just from deciding how to think about the first two questions, right? So there'll be other kinds of things that we have to talk about, like the importance of freedom of expression, and things like that are also important when it comes to the question of whether a community should tolerate artworks like this. But certainly I think that if we get to that question, I mean, we do have to sort of take into account the issue of, well, how do, does the artwork, for example, is it typically consumed by people who are especially vulnerable to the influence of this kind of thing? So maybe video games are typically played by young, impressionable people. Maybe young people are not that impressionable, right? So there are lots of kind of questions like that we have to ask when we ask the question of whether a just community should tolerate these kinds of things. And so that you'd have to have a whole other discussion and a whole other argument, really, which we probably don't have a lot of time to do here, about what the communal response should be to these kinds of things. And that will, I think, incorporate some of the things that you mentioned about the way in which we are asked to immerse ourselves in them and things like that.
I just want to say it's 6 o'clock now. If you have to go, please be quiet. Step out of the back. Don't make too much noise, because we're going to keep this party going. If you have to go, that's fine. But I know that some people still want to ask some questions. So if you want to keep talking, just come up to the front here. We'll keep it going. Could we all please give a round of applause for Jonathan, okay, for being so kick-ass here?
Thank you.
Thank you.